The Montana winter showed no mercy as the stagecoach rattled through the snow-laden pines of Willow Creek. Inside, Eleanor Mitchell's gloved fingers traced the edge of her wool scarf, ensuring it remained high enough to cover the right side of her face. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. She had spent the last 4 days rehearsing what she would say when she finally met Edward Caldwell, the man whose letters had promised her a fresh start, far from the whispers of Philadelphia society. What his letters hadn't mentioned was his family or their expectations. "I don't care what kind of assurances you had, miss. We didn't send for damaged goods." Mrs. Caldwell's voice cut through the warmth of their parlor, her eyes never quite meeting Eleanor's, instead fixing somewhere above her left shoulder. Edward, the son who had written such promising letters, stood silent behind his mother, his face a mask of discomfort and disappointment. "My son needs a wife who can stand beside him at church socials, who won't cause talk, who can give him proper children." Mrs. Caldwell's gaze finally dropped to the scars that Eleanor's hastily adjusted scarf had revealed, jagged reminders of the fire that had claimed her parents and her former life. The temperature seemed to drop further as Eleanor realized the cruel simplicity of her situation. 4 days of travel, the last of her savings spent, and the Caldwells had decided before she'd even stepped fully into their home. One look at her scarred face had been enough. The snow had begun to fall again by the time Eleanor found herself standing outside the Willow Creek General Store, her single trunk at her feet. The Caldwells hadn't even offered her a night's lodging, just $20 pressed into her palm by a silent Edward, his eyes never meeting hers, and directions to the stagecoach office for the next departure. 3 days from now. Night was approaching, the temperature dropping with the sun. Eleanor pulled her coat tighter, the inadequate fabric doing little against the Montana cold she was so unprepared for. Philadelphia winters had never felt like this, like the air itself might shatter if she breathed too deeply. "Store's closing, miss." The shopkeeper, a thin woman with graying hair pulled severely back, stood in the doorway. Her eyes widened slightly at the sight of Eleanor's face before she controlled her expression. "You waiting for someone?" Eleanor swallowed her pride, which had become easier with each passing hour. "I need lodging. Is there somewhere in town? I might stay until the stage leaves." The woman, Beatrice Wilson, according to the sign above the shop, frowned. "Hotel's full with the cattle buyers in town. Boarding house doesn't take single women." Her eyes flicked again to Eleanor's scars before she added, "especially ones with no connections here." "I see." Eleanor's voice remained steady, a skill she'd perfected over years of pretending not to notice the stares. "Thank you anyway." The street had emptied as darkness fell, lamps casting weak golden pools that did nothing to warm the air. Eleanor sat on her trunk, calculating her options with the same methodical precision her father had taught her for his accounting books. $20 would get her halfway back east, but to where? There was nothing left for her in Philadelphia. No family, no prospects, and now not even the false promise of a frontier marriage. The wind picked up, driving needles of ice against her exposed skin. She would need shelter soon, or the cold would become dangerous. Eleanor had just decided to try the church when she heard the uneven footsteps approaching through the snow. "Miss, you've been sitting there near an hour now." The voice was deep, rough-edged, but not unkind. Eleanor looked up to see a tall figure standing at the edge of the lamplight. His broad shoulders were dusted with snow, a wide-brimmed hat pulled low shadowing his features. His stance was slightly off balance, favoring his right side. "I'm fine, thank you," she replied automatically, turning her face so that her scarf concealed her right side. The man didn't move. Temperatures dropping below 0 tonight. You don't look dressed for it." He paused, then added, "I heard the Caldwells sent you away." News traveled quickly in small towns. Eleanor felt heat rise to her cheeks despite the cold. "Yes, the stagecoach leaves in 3 days, and you've nowhere to stay." It wasn't a question. Eleanor remained silent, her pride warring with practicality. The man stepped closer, and she tensed instinctively. "I'm Matthew Donovan. I own a ranch outside town." He remained a respectful distance away. "My housekeeper, Maria, has a room above the kitchen. It's warm. You'd be left alone." Eleanor studied him, trying to discern his intentions. In the lamplight, she could now see the left side of his face, a landscape of burned scars that pulled his mouth into a permanent half-grimace, the skin mottled and taut, from his jaw up past where his hat brim cut off her view. Something in her expression made him turn his face away slightly. "I understand if you'd rather take your chances elsewhere." The wind howled down the street, carrying a fresh assault of snowflakes. Eleanor made her decision. "I'm Eleanor Mitchell. I would be grateful for shelter until the stage leaves." His wagon was parked at the end of the street, a sturdy workhorse stamping impatiently in the cold. Matthew loaded her trunk with surprising ease despite his apparent limp, then offered her his gloved hand to help her onto the seat. She noticed he kept his scarred side turned away from her, just as she kept her scars from his view. They rode in silence through the worsening snowfall, the wagon creaking as it left the town behind. Eleanor's thoughts raced with the risk she was taking, heading into the wilderness with a stranger. But something in Matthew Donovan's careful distance, the way he hadn't stared at her scars, made her think this risk was better than freezing on the streets of Willow Creek. "It's another 20 minutes to the ranch," he said eventually, his voice barely audible over the wind. "Road gets rough after the bridge." Eleanor nodded, then realized he might not see the gesture in the darkness. "Thank you for your kindness, Mr. Donovan." "Matt," he corrected, then added after a pause, "It's not kindness, just decency." The difference seemed important to him, so Eleanor didn't argue. Instead, she watched the snow-covered landscape pass by, the dark silhouettes of pine trees standing sentinel along the road. Her life had narrowed to this moment. A rejected bride with nowhere to go, sitting beside a scarred rancher in a snowstorm. It wasn't the future she had imagined when she'd answered Edward Caldwell's advertisement, but at least she would survive the night. The Donovan Ranch emerged from the darkness gradually. First the glow of windows, then the solid shape of a two-story house built from rough-hewn logs, but larger than Eleanor had expected. A barn stood nearby, and what looked like several smaller outbuildings. As they approached, a door opened, spilling golden lamplight onto the snow. "Matthew? Is that you?" In this storm, I thought. The woman who stood in the doorway fell silent as she spotted Eleanor. She was short and round, with silver-streaked black hair and a lined face that spoke of a life lived outdoors. "Maria, this is Miss Mitchell. She needs the room above the kitchen for a few days." Matt's tone left no room for questions as he helped Eleanor down from the wagon. Maria's expression shifted from surprise to understanding as she caught sight of Eleanor's partially concealed face. "Of course. Come in, come in. You must be half frozen." The warmth of the kitchen enveloped Eleanor like an embrace as she stepped. Inside, the smell of baking bread and something savory simmering on the stove made her suddenly aware of how long it had been since she'd eaten. Maria bustled around, taking her coat and scarf with gentle efficiency. "Sit by the fire, dear. I'll bring you some stew and then show you to your room." Her eyes lingered briefly on Eleanor's scars, but without the revulsion Eleanor had grown accustomed to seeing. Matthew remained by the door, snowmelt dripping from his coat. "I need to stable the horse. Maria will see to your needs." He hesitated, then added, "You're safe here, Miss Mitchell. With that, he disappeared back into the storm, leaving Eleanor to wonder at the strange turn her fortunes had taken. Maria set a bowl of thick beef stew before her, along with a chunk of fresh bread. "Eat now. Questions later," the housekeeper instructed, pouring a cup of coffee and setting it beside the bowl. Eleanor didn't need to be told twice. As she ate, she gradually became aware of the details of the kitchen. The well-worn but clean floors, the row of copper pots hanging above the enormous cast-iron stove, the neat stack of firewood beside the hearth. This was a house that someone had taken pride in, despite its remote location. "The Caldwells are fools," Maria said suddenly, breaking the comfortable silence. "Edward never had the spine to stand up to his mother, and that woman has ideas above her station." Eleanor set down her spoon, unsure how to respond. Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel. It means a lot to us. Now back to the story. Maria waved a hand dismissively. "Everyone in town knows they sent for a bride for him. Everyone also knows they sent you away the same day." Her dark eyes were direct but kind. "Their loss may be your good fortune, though they'd never see it. Oh, that way." "I don't understand," Eleanor said. "You will." Maria stood, gathering Eleanor's empty bowl. "Come, I'll show you to your room. You can wash up there. I've already sent hot water up. We can talk more tomorrow when you've rested." The room above the kitchen was small but immaculately clean, with a narrow bed, a washstand, and a small chest of drawers. A window looked out toward what Eleanor guessed would be the mountains when daylight came. Most importantly, heat rose from the kitchen below, making the space cozy despite the storm that rattled the glass. "Matthew's room is across the hall," Maria explained as she set down Eleanor's small handbag. "Mine is downstairs, near the pantry. Thomas, that's Matthew's brother, has the room at the end of the hall, but he's away delivering horses until spring thaw." Eleanor nodded, questions still swirling in her mind. "Mr. Donovan, his face." Maria's expression softened. "The fire was 3 years ago. Took the barn, nearly took the house. Matthew got everyone out, including the horses." She paused. "He paid for it with his skin and his knee. The doctor said he was lucky to keep his eye and his leg." Eleanor thought of her own scars, the result of being pulled from the burning ruins of her family home. Not luck, just the cruel randomness of survival. "Rest now," Maria said, patting Eleanor's hand. "Morning comes early on a ranch, storm or no storm." Alone at last, Eleanor removed her scarf fully, examining her reflection in the small mirror. Above the washstand, the familiar landscape of her scarred face stared back at her, the puckered skin that pulled her right eye slightly downward, the rippled texture that spread from her temple down to her jawline. It had been 5 years, and still the sight sometimes startled her. She thought of Matthew Donovan, turning his burned face away as if to spare her the sight. Perhaps here, in this isolated place, with these wounded people, she might find a few days' peace before facing an uncertain future once again. The storm continued through the night and into the next day, sealing the ranch in a cocoon of white. Eleanor woke to the smell of coffee and bacon drifting up from the kitchen below. For a moment, she lay still, listening to the unfamiliar sounds of the house, the creak of floorboards, the distant low of cattle, the steady rhythm of someone chopping wood despite the weather. Maria had laid out fresh towels and a pitcher of warm water. Eleanor washed and dressed quickly, choosing her plainest dress but hesitating over her scarf. After a moment's consideration, she left it off. These people had already seen her scars. Pretense seemed pointless. The kitchen was empty when she descended the narrow stairs, though a place had been set at the table with a covered plate keeping warm by the stove. A note in neat handwriting informed her that Maria had gone to help with the morning chores and would return shortly. Eleanor had just finished eating when the door opened, bringing with it a blast of cold air and Matthew Donovan, his shoulders covered in snow, his breathing labored from exertion. He stopped short at the sight of her, his uneven stance becoming more pronounced as he quickly removed his hat. "Miss Mitchell, I hope you slept well." "Very well, thank you." Eleanor remained seated, her hands folded in her lap, making no attempt to hide her face. "The room is most comfortable." Matthew nodded, his eyes meeting hers briefly before sliding away. Without his hat, she could see the full extent of his burns, covering the left side of his face from forehead to jaw, twisting up into his hairline where no hair grew. Like hers, his left ear was partially melted, and the corner of his mouth pulled downward in a permanent expression of solemn contemplation. "The storm's getting worse," he said, moving to the stove where a coffee pot sat keeping warm. "Road to town will be impassable for at least 2 days." Eleanor felt a flicker of alarm. "The stagecoach won't be running while the pass is snowed in." Matthew poured himself coffee, his movements efficient despite the obvious stiffness in his left hand. "You may be here longer than you planned." The thought should have frightened her, stranded in a remote ranch with strangers. But instead, Eleanor felt a curious sense of relief, a reprieve from decisions, from the need to create yet another plan for her future. "I can work," she offered, "to earn my keep while I'm here." Matthew turned to face her fully for the first time, his expression unreadable through the scarred terrain of his features. "That won't be necessary." "I insist." Eleanor straightened her spine, summoning the dignity her mother had always emphasized. "I'm not accustomed to charity, Mr. Donovan." A sound that might have been a chuckle escaped him. "Providing shelter in a blizzard isn't charity, Miss Mitchell. It's survival." He took a sip of his coffee. "But if you wish to help Maria with household tasks, I won't stop you." Before Eleanor could respond, the door opened again, and Maria bustled in, bringing with her the scent of the barn and fresh snow. "Cattle are fed. Chickens are complaining as usual," she reported, shaking the snow from her shawl. "And young Jimmy from the North Pasture Cabin rode in. Says the creek's rising with the melt under the snow. Could flood if the temperature rises too fast." Matthew's expression darkened. "The lower pasture fencing won't hold if it floods. We'll need to move those cattle today." He set down his coffee cup with a decisive click. "Miss Mitchell, I apologize, but duty calls." "Mr. Donovan," Eleanor said, rising from her seat. "I grew up on a farm in Pennsylvania. I understand emergencies. Please don't concern yourself with entertaining me." Something like surprise flickered across his face. A farm girl? The Caldwells thought they were getting a city lady. Eleanor lifted her chin. They were mistaken about many things. For the first time, Matthew's scarred mouth twitched in what might have been a smile. "So it seems." He nodded to Maria. "I'll take Jimmy and head to the lower pasture. We should be back by nightfall." After he left, Maria turned to Eleanor with raised eyebrows. "A farm girl indeed. That explains the calluses I noticed on your hands. Not exactly what one expects from a mail-order bride." Eleanor felt heat rise to her cheeks. "My father was an accountant, but after my mother died, we moved to my uncle's farm. I learned to work the land alongside my cousins." Maria nodded approvingly. "Useful skills. Now, since you're so set on earning your keep, you can help me with the bread. The men will be hungry when they return, and this storm makes everyone eat like wolves." The day passed quickly as Eleanor fell into the familiar rhythm of household work. She kneaded dough alongside Maria, helped preserve vegetables from the root cellar, and mended clothes that had been set aside for attention. The physical labor was soothing, requiring just enough concentration to keep her mind from wandering to uncertain futures. "You have a deft hand with a needle," Maria observed, as Eleanor repaired a tear in what she assumed was Matthew's shirt, judging by its size. My mother insisted I learn proper ladies' skills alongside the farm work, Eleanor explained. She always said circumstances change, but capabilities remain. Maria hummed thoughtfully. Wise woman, your mother. She paused in her work of chopping potatoes. What happened to your family, if you don't mind my asking? A young woman doesn't usually travel across the country to marry a stranger unless there's not much holding her at home. Eleanor's hands stilled momentarily. Fire. 5 years ago. My parents didn't survive. The words were easier to say than they once had been, worn smooth by repetition. I lived with my uncle afterward, but when he remarried, she shrugged. His new wife had her own children. There wasn't room for me in any sense. Maria's eyes were soft with understanding. And the scars kept the local men from courting you? That, and the fact that I came with no dowry and too many opinions? Eleanor resumed her stitching. My uncle showed me Edward Caldwell's advertisement. It seemed a practical solution. Edward Caldwell, Maria scoffed, works in the bank, lets his mother cut his meat for him at 30 years old. You're fortunate to have escaped that household, even if it doesn't feel that way yet. Eleanor couldn't help but smile at the housekeeper's blunt assessment. And Mr. Donovan, how did he come to be here? Maria's expression grew more serious. The Donovans have owned this land for 2 generations. Matthew's father built this house, started the ranch. When he and his wife died of influenza 6 years back, Matthew took over. He was doing well too, expanding the herd, improving the bloodlines. Then came the fire. She fell silent for a moment, her hands continuing their work mechanically. It wasn't just his body that was burned. Something in his spirit too. He retreated from town, from people, does business when he must, but otherwise stays here working from dawn till dusk as if trying to outrun his thoughts. She fixed Eleanor with a direct look, until yesterday when he rode into town during a snowstorm and came back with you. Eleanor felt her chest tighten with an unnamed emotion. He took pity on me. Matthew Donovan doesn't do pity, Maria corrected firmly. He saw someone the world had been cruel to, standing alone in the cold. He made a choice. The conversation was interrupted by the distant sound of men's voices and horses approaching. Maria moved to the window. They're back earlier than expected. The creek must not have been as bad as Jimmy thought. She turned to Eleanor. There's hot water for washing in the back room. They'll be frozen half to death. The kitchen was quickly filled with the presence of men stamping snow from their boots, their voices loud after the quiet day. Matthew entered last, his tall frame filling the doorway momentarily before he stepped aside to let a young ranch hand through. Creek's holding for now, he reported to Maria, but we moved the cattle to higher ground as a precaution. His eyes found Eleanor, still seated at the table with his mended shirt in her lap. For a moment, he seemed at a loss for words. Miss Mitchell has been making herself useful, Maria explained, already ladling stew into bowls for the hungry men. Matthew approached slowly, his limp more pronounced after the day's exertion. That wasn't necessary. Eleanor held up the finished shirt. It was torn at the shoulder seam. I've reinforced it. He took it from her hands carefully, as if it were made of something far more precious than worn cotton. Thank you. His voice was gruff, but his scarred face softened momentarily. You have skilled hands. From necessity, not choice, she replied honestly. Something like recognition flickered in his eyes. The best skills often come that way. The meal that followed was unlike any Eleanor had experienced in years. The ranch hands, Jimmy, a freckled youth of perhaps 17, and Hank, an older man with a weather-beaten face, treated her with a courteous lack of curiosity that she found refreshing. They spoke of cattle and weather, fence repairs, and a mountain lion that had been sighted near the North Ridge. No one stared at her scars, or if they noticed them, they gave no sign. Matthew spoke little, but Eleanor observed how the men deferred to him naturally, looking to him for decisions and direction. He ate methodically, his damaged left hand sometimes awkward with the utensils, but he made no attempt to hide the difficulty as he might have in more formal company. After the meal, the ranch hands departed for their bunkhouse, leaving Eleanor with Matthew and Maria in the warm kitchen. An unfamiliar sense of contentment had settled over Eleanor, a momentary reprieve from the constant anxiety that had been her companion since receiving the letter from Edward Caldwell months ago. "The storm's easing," Matthew said, breaking the comfortable silence. "Roads should be clear enough by tomorrow afternoon. I can take you into town then if you wish." Reality intruded on Eleanor's brief peace. Tomorrow. Decisions to make, a future to determine with resources that were rapidly dwindling. She nodded, not trusting her voice. Maria, sensing the shift in mood, tactfully announced she was retiring for the night, leaving Eleanor and Matthew alone by the dying fire. "What will you do?" he asked after several minutes had passed. "When you reach town?" Eleanor had been considering this question all day. "The stagecoach, if it's running." "To Helena, perhaps. I have enough for a ticket and a few nights' lodging. I can seek employment there." Matthew stared into the flames, his scarred profile cast in gold and shadow. "As what? A seamstress, perhaps, or a cook's helper. I'm not afraid of hard work." Eleanor straightened her shoulders. "I'll manage, Mr. Donovan. I always have." He turned to look at her then, his gaze direct in a way it hadn't been before. "I believe you would." He seemed to be weighing something in his mind. "But there's another possibility you might consider." Eleanor waited, a strange tension building in her chest. "My ranch needs a housekeeper who can also keep accounts." He spoke carefully, as if each word was being selected with precision. "Maria is getting older. She can't manage everything as she once did, and I'm—" He gestured vaguely to his scarred side, "not as capable in some ways as before." Eleanor stared at him, understanding slowly dawning. "You're offering me employment? Room, board, and wages. Proper wages." His expression was unreadable in the firelight. "You'd have your own cabin, the one near the orchard. It's small but sound. Why?" The question escaped before Eleanor could consider its rudeness. "You know nothing about me." Matthew's scarred mouth twitched. "I know you mended my shirt without being asked. I know you faced hardship and survived. I know the Caldwells are fools." He paused. "And I know what it's like to have people look at you and see only what fire has taken, not what remains." Eleanor felt as if the air had been pulled from her lungs. No one had ever spoken so directly about her scars, about the experience of living behind a changed face. Certainly, no one had ever suggested that anything of value remained. "You don't have to answer now," he added, rising from his chair with the careful movements of a man accustomed to pain. "Think on it overnight." As he moved toward the door, Eleanor found her voice. "Mr. Donovan." He paused, looking back at her. "Thank you for seeing what remains." His nod was almost imperceptible, but in the firelight, Eleanor thought she saw the ghost of a smile cross his damaged features before he disappeared into the darkness of the hallway, leaving her alone with possibilities she had never dared to consider. Morning arrived, with pale sunlight streaming through the small window of Eleanor's room above the kitchen. The storm had passed during the night, leaving behind a transformed world of pristine white. The decision before her seemed equally transformative. Stay at Donovan Ranch as a housekeeper, or continue her uncertain journey elsewhere. Eleanor dressed methodically, her mind working through the practicalities as she had been taught to do since childhood. Matthew Donovan's offer was unexpected, but not unwelcome. Employment, shelter, and a measure of independence were more than she had dared hope for when the Caldwells had turned her away. The scent of coffee drifted up from below, drawing her downstairs where she found Matthew already seated at the kitchen. A table, a ledger open before him. His scarred hand moved carefully across the page, recording figures in a surprisingly elegant script. "Good morning, Mr. Donovan." Eleanor paused at the foot of the stairs, suddenly aware of the intimacy of the moment, the two of them alone in the quiet kitchen, sunlight spilling across the worn floorboards. He looked up, his expression guarded, but not unwelcoming. "Miss Mitchell, did you sleep well?" "Yes, thank you." She moved to the stove where the coffee pot sat warming. "May I pour you more coffee?" "Please." The domesticity of the gesture wasn't lost on Eleanor as she filled his cup, then one for herself. This could be her life now. These simple daily interactions, this sturdy house with its practical comforts, this scarred man with his direct gaze and careful words. "I've considered your offer," she said, sitting across from him at the table. "I'm grateful, and I accept." Matthew studied her for a moment, his good eye thoughtful. "You should know what you're agreeing to before you decide. The work is hard, the days are long, and town is a 2-hour ride away." He closed the ledger. "With deliberate care, people will talk, a single woman living on a man's ranch, regardless of the arrangement." "People have been talking about me since I was 16, Eleanor replied evenly. "I've learned to live with it." A flicker of something, respect perhaps, crossed his features. "Nevertheless, there are proprieties to consider. Your cabin would be your own, your duties clearly defined. No one here would impose upon you in any way." "I understand." Eleanor took a sip of her coffee, finding comfort in its bitter warmth. "And I appreciate your concern for my reputation, Mr. Donovan, but I learned long ago that some things matter more than what others think. Security, purpose, a place to belong." Matthew nodded slowly. "Then we are agreed." He extended his hand across the table, his right hand, she noticed, not the scarred left. "Welcome to Donovan Ranch, Miss Mitchell." Eleanor placed her hand in his, feeling the calluses that spoke of years of hard work. His grip was firm but gentle, and for a brief moment she felt anchored after months of drifting uncertainty. "When Maria wakes, she'll help you get settled," he continued, releasing her hand. "The cabin needs airing out, and there are supplies to arrange. I'll have Hank bring your trunk from upstairs." "I can manage my own trunk," Eleanor assured him. "And I'm eager to see the accounts, if you're willing to show me that part of my duties as well." Surprise registered on his face. "You understand bookkeeping?" "My father was an accountant before he turned to farming. He taught me." She gestured to the ledger. "If you'd prefer to keep that task for yourself, I understand." Matthew hesitated, then slid the leather-bound book toward her. "The ranch operates on tight margins. Every penny must be accounted for, especially after the fire. We lost breeding stock, had to rebuild the barn and fencing." He trailed off, his scarred hand unconsciously moving to his damaged face. Eleanor opened the ledger, immediately recognizing the orderly rows of figures. "You keep meticulous records," she observed, paging through the entries of the previous months. "But if I may—" She paused, uncertain if she was overstepping. "Speak freely, Miss Mitchell. I didn't hire you for silence. You're spending too much on feed from the general store." She pointed to a recurring entry. "The markup is nearly double what it should be. Have you considered buying directly from farmers to the east?" Something like amusement flickered in Matthew's eyes. "Beatrice Wilson's husband sets the prices. He's not inclined to negotiate." "Then perhaps it's time to give him competition," Eleanor suggested. "My uncle traded with farmers near Helena. Quality grain at fair prices, delivered monthly." Matthew leaned back in his chair, regarding her with newfound interest. "You have connections there." Names, at least. Letters of introduction could be arranged. A slow nod. Write them. We'll see what comes of it. The door opened then, bringing with it a blast of cold air, and Maria, her arms laden with eggs, collected from the henhouse. She stopped short at the sight of them sitting together over the ledger. "Well now," she said, a knowing smile spreading across her face. "Looks like decisions have been made." "Miss Mitchell has agreed to stay on as housekeeper and accountant," Matthew confirmed, rising from his chair. "She'll need help settling into the orchard cabin today." Maria's smile widened. "Best news I've heard this winter." She set the basket of eggs on the counter. "That cabin's been empty too long. Needs a woman's touch. It needs a thorough cleaning first," Eleanor said practically, "and an inventory of what supplies we'll require." "We," Maria repeated with satisfaction. "Listen to that, Matthew, already thinking like she belongs." Eleanor felt heat rise to her cheeks, but Matthew merely nodded. "I'll be in the north pasture with Hank and Jimmy. The fence was damaged in the storm." He paused at the door, looking back at Eleanor. "Welcome home, Miss Mitchell." The words followed her throughout the morning as she and Maria tackled the small cabin that was to be her new home. Welcome home. When was the last time anyone had said that to her? Not her uncle, certainly, whose grudging hospitality had always been tinged with resentment. Not in the boarding houses and temporary lodgings she had passed through on her journey west. Perhaps not since before the fire that had claimed her parents and marked her forever. The orchard cabin was simple but solidly built, with a main room, containing a stone fireplace, a small bedroom, and a lean-to kitchen. It had clearly been unoccupied for some time. Dust covered every surface, and mice had made nests in the cupboards, but the structure itself was sound. "Thomas lived here before he went off to deliver those horses," Maria explained as they swept cobwebs from the ceiling corners. "He's Matthew's younger brother, 23 and full of restlessness. Been gone since fall, probably won't be back until spring thaw." "Does he work on the ranch as well?" Eleanor asked, thinking of the vast amount of land she had glimpsed from her window. "When the mood strikes him." Maria's tone was affectionate but exasperated. "Thomas has his father's charm and his mother's stubbornness, but none of Matthew's sense of responsibility. He comes and goes like the wind, that boy." She paused her sweeping. "They're different as night and day, those brothers, even more so since the fire." Eleanor's hands stilled on the counter she was scrubbing. "Mr. Donovan mentioned that they lost stock in the fire. Was it very bad?" Maria's expression grew somber. "Bad enough. Started in the barn during a summer drought. Spread faster than anyone could believe. Matthew got everyone out, the hands, the horses, even the barn cats. Then went back in for the ledger and breeding records." She shook her head. "Beam fell, trapped him. By the time they pulled him out, the damage was done." Eleanor thought of her own experience. The crushing weight of fallen timbers, the searing heat, the desperate gasping for air in a room filled with smoke. She had been unconscious when rescuers had pulled her from the ruins of her family home, had awakened days later to the news that she was an orphan, her face forever changed. The town doctor said he'd lose the eye, maybe the arm, might never walk properly again. Pride crept into Maria's voice. "Shows what he knows." Matthew was back on a horse within 3 months, running this ranch one-handed until his left arm healed enough to be useful. "That explains the limp," Eleanor said softly, "and his hand. Burns scarred the tendons. He can use it, but not like before." Maria returned to her sweeping with renewed vigor. "But he never complained, not once, just did what needed doing." By midday, they had made significant progress on the cabin. Fresh linens adorned the narrow bed, the floors gleamed from scrubbing, and a fire crackled in the hearth, dispelling the lingering chill. Maria had brought supplies from the main house, dishes, cooking utensils, basic foodstuffs to stock the pantry. "We'll bring the rest tomorrow," she promised. "Your trunk too, once Hank has time to help. For now, let's get back to the house for dinner. The men will be coming in hungry." As they walked back through the orchard, bare apple trees standing, like sentinels against the snow-covered ground, Eleanor found herself studying the layout of the ranch with new eyes. The main house stood at the center, with the large rebuilt barn nearby. The bunkhouse where the ranch hands slept was visible beyond that, and in the distance, snow-covered pastures stretched toward the mountains. It was a working enterprise, where every person and animal had a purpose, including her now. The thought was still settling in her mind when they rounded the corner of the orchard and came upon Matthew in the yard. He was splitting firewood, his coat discarded despite the cold, his broad shoulders flexing with each swing of the axe. He moved with the economy of motion that spoke of years of practice, compensating for the stiffness in his left side with the strength of his right. Eleanor found herself pausing, struck by the sight. This man, who had been so grievously injured, who still carried the evidence of that injury in every movement, refused to be defined by his limitations. There was dignity in his labor, a quiet defiance in his refusal to surrender to circumstance. He looked up, sensing their presence, and straightened. Sweat had dampened his shirt despite the winter chill, and his breathing came in visible puffs of condensation. "The cabin meets with your approval?" he asked, embedding the axe in the chopping block. "It's perfect," Eleanor replied honestly. "More than I expected." Something like pleasure flickered across his scarred features. "Good. It was built to last." "Like everything here, I imagine," she said. He regarded her thoughtfully, wiping his brow with his sleeve. "Not everything survives, Miss Mitchell, but what does can grow stronger for having been tested." The words lingered between them, weighted with shared understanding. Then Maria cleared her throat, breaking the moment. "Dinner won't cook itself," she announced, heading toward the house, "and these old bones need warming by the fire." Eleanor nodded, suddenly aware that she had been staring. "Of course. I should help." "You've done enough for your first day," Matthew said, retrieving his coat from the fence post. "Rest. Tomorrow will bring its own work." But Eleanor shook her head. "I prefer to be useful, Mr. Donovan. Idleness has never suited me." A faint smile crossed his face. "I'm beginning to see that." The pattern of days established itself quickly. After that, Eleanor rose before dawn each morning, helping Maria prepare breakfast for the ranch hands before they headed out to their various tasks. She spent the mornings cleaning, mending, and attending to household matters in the main house, then the afternoons working on the ranch accounts or tackling the ongoing restoration of her cabin. Matthew was often absent during daylight hours, riding out with Hank and Jimmy to check fences, tend to cattle, or handle the myriad tasks required to keep the ranch functioning through the Montana winter. But he was always present at the evening meal, his quiet authority anchoring the household, his occasional dry observations making even taciturn Hank crack a smile. Gradually, Eleanor began to feel herself thawing from the inside out, like the creek beds Matthew spoke of that would soon be flowing with spring melt. The crushing weight of uncertainty that had been her constant companion since leaving Philadelphia began to ease, replaced by the simpler pressure of daily responsibilities and physical labor. A week after her arrival, she wrote the letters of introduction to her uncle's grain contacts near Helena, carefully explaining the Donovan Ranch's requirements and inquiring about delivery options. Matthew reviewed the letters briefly before nodding his approval. "You have a way with words," he observed, sealing the envelopes with wax. "Clear and direct, no unnecessary flattery." "My father believed honesty was the foundation of good business," Eleanor replied, watching as he pressed the Donovan Ranch seal into the cooling wax. "Though my uncle preferred a more..." embellished approach. Matthew's mouth twitched in what she had come to recognize as his version of a smile. "And which do you prefer, Miss Mitchell?" She considered the question seriously. Truth has the virtue of simplicity. One needn't remember what lies were told to whom. He looked at her then with an intensity that made her breath catch. "A practical philosophy." "I am a practical woman, Mr. Donovan." "So you are." He handed her the sealed letters. "These can go out with Hank tomorrow when he rides to town for supplies. Is there anything you need from Willow Creek?" Eleanor thought. Of the few possessions in her trunk, the limited wardrobe suitable for ranch work. Thread, perhaps, and writing paper if it's not too dear. Make a list. Whatever you need for your work here is a ranch expense. The consideration in this simple statement touched Eleanor deeply. How long had it been since someone had asked what she needed and then provided it without question? Since before the fire, certainly. Her uncle had made it clear that every piece of clothing, every morsel of food was provided out of duty, not care. "Thank you," she said simply. Matthew nodded, then hesitated as if wanting to say more. Finally he asked, "Are you comfortable in the cabin?" "Very much so," Eleanor smiled. "I've never had a place entirely my own before. It's a luxury I hadn't expected." "Good," he cleared his throat. "If you need anything, that is, Maria mentioned, the roof might leak when the snow begins to melt. I'll let you know immediately if there are any problems," she assured him, touched by his concern. "But so far it's perfect." Perfect was perhaps an overstatement. The cabin was drafty in places, and she had discovered that the chimney smoked when the wind blew from the east. But it was hers, a sacred space where she could remove the invisible armor she had worn for so many years, where she didn't need to brace herself for stares or whispers or pitying glances, where she could simply be Eleanor, neither defined by her scars nor required to pretend they didn't exist. The weather warmed as January gave way to February, bringing alternating cycles of melt and freeze that made ranch work treacherous. Eleanor watched from the kitchen window one afternoon as Matthew and the hands guided nervous cattle across an icy patch of pasture, their breath fogging in the cold air, their movements careful and deliberate. "He's good with them," Maria observed, coming to stand beside her at the window. "Always had a way with animals, even before the fire," Eleanor finished when Maria trailed off. "You don't need to avoid mentioning it on my account. We both know what fire can do." Maria's weathered hand came to rest gently on Eleanor's shoulder. "Yes, we do, but knowing and speaking of it are different things. Mr. Donovan doesn't talk about it either," Eleanor noted, "though it shaped his life as much as mine was shaped by my own experience. Matthew keeps his thoughts close, always has, even as a boy." Maria's eyes followed his figure in the distance, but he sees more than people realize, feels more too. Eleanor nodded, watching as Matthew dismounted to help a calf that had slipped on the ice. Despite his own impaired mobility, he moved with confident purpose, his hands gentle but firm as he guided the animal to safer ground. "He's a good man," she said softly. "The best," Maria agreed. "Too good to spend his life alone on this ranch, if you ask me." Eleanor glanced at her sharply. "Surely he has prospects in town. A man with his qualities, his land." "Had prospects aplenty before the fire," Maria said dryly. "Young ladies, from Willow Creek to Helena calling with pies and invitations. Afterward," she sighed, "some couldn't look past the scars. Others couldn't abide his withdrawal from society. He stopped riding into town except for business, stopped attending socials and church gatherings. He went to town the day we met," Eleanor pointed out, "in a snowstorm, no less." Maria's eyes held a knowing gleam. "So he did. First time in months he'd gone for anything but supplies or banking." She patted Eleanor's arm. "Now help me with these preserves. The blackberry won't seal itself." The conversation lingered in Eleanor's mind as she worked alongside Maria, carefully filling jars with the rich purple preserves they had cooked that morning. What had prompted Matthew to ride into town that snowy evening? Mere coincidence that had placed him in her path at the moment of her greatest need, or something else, some recognition of a kindred spirit that had made him offer shelter to a stranger. She had no answers, only questions that seemed too presumptuous to ask. Instead, she focused on the task at hand, on the satisfying rhythm of productive work, on the small sense of belonging she was beginning to feel in this place. Later that evening, after the ranch hands had retired to the bunkhouse and Maria to her room, Eleanor found herself alone in the kitchen with Matthew. He had spread maps of the ranch across the table and was marking areas for spring planting and pasture rotation. The lamplight cast his scarred profile in sharp relief against the warm, wood-paneled walls. "May I ask you something, Mr. Donovan?" Eleanor ventured, setting aside the shirt she had been mending. He looked up, his good eye questioning. "Of course. Why did you come to town that night? The night we met?" His hands stilled on the maps. For a long moment he was silent, and Eleanor feared she had overstepped some boundary. Then, carefully, he folded the maps and set them aside. "Supplies, ostensibly," he said finally. "But the truth is more complicated." Eleanor waited, allowing him the space to continue or not as he chose. "I heard about the mail-order bride the Caldwells had sent for. Small towns thrive on such news." His voice was measured, his gaze fixed somewhere beyond her shoulder. "Then Beatrice Wilson's son mentioned they'd turned you away, left you standing in the cold with nowhere to go." Embarrassment heated Eleanor's cheeks. News does travel quickly. In Willow Creek. Too quickly sometimes. Matthew's scarred hand rested on the table, fingers slightly curled from the tightened tendons. "I know what it's like. To be judged for something you had no control over. To be found wanting based solely on appearance." The simple acknowledgement of their shared experience struck Eleanor with unexpected force. How long had it been since someone had truly understood? Since she hadn't had to explain or justify or pretend. "So you came to offer help," she said softly. "I came because I couldn't bear to think of someone else being treated as I had been." His gaze finally met hers, direct and unguarded. "And when I saw you there, so straight back despite everything, I knew." He trailed off, and Eleanor found herself leaning forward slightly. "Knew what?" A faint smile touched his lips. "That Beatrice Wilson was a fool to turn you away, just as the Caldwells were fools to reject you. That anyone with eyes could see your worth if they bothered to look past the surface." Eleanor's breath caught in her throat. "Most people don't." "Bother? I'm not most people," he said simply. "Neither are you." The moment stretched between them, filled with unspoken understanding. Then Matthew cleared his throat and rose from the table. "It's late. You should get back to your cabin before the temperature drops further." Eleanor gathered her sewing, suddenly aware of the impropriety of their conversation, of the two of them alone in the kitchen so late in the evening. "Of course. Thank you for answering my question." He nodded, then moved to the door, retrieving a lantern from its hook. "I'll walk you back." "There's no need. The path can be treacherous after dark," he insisted. "I'd rather see you safely home." Home. There was that word again, settling into her consciousness with increasing familiarity. Matthew held the door for her, then led the way across the yard, the lantern casting a golden glow on the snow-covered path to the orchard. They walked in companionable silence, their breath visible in the cold night air. The stars spread across, the vast Montana sky like diamonds scattered on velvet, more numerous than Eleanor had ever seen in Philadelphia or on her uncle's farm. The quiet was profound, broken only by the crunch of their boots on packed snow and the distant howl of what might have been a wolf or coyote. As they approached the cabin, warm light glowed from within. Maria must have lit the lamps before retiring, a thoughtful gesture that touched Eleanor deeply. Matthew paused at the bottom of the 3 steps that led to her door. "Will you be warm enough tonight?" he asked, his voice low in the darkness. "The temperature's dropping." "I banked the fire before dinner," Eleanor assured him, "and Maria provided plenty of quilts." He nodded, seemingly relieved. "Good. Tomorrow's weather should be milder. Jimmy thinks we might see the first real thaw next week." "Spring comes earlier here than in Pennsylvania," Eleanor observed. "My father always said we shouldn't expect true spring until April." "It comes in fits and starts," Matthew agreed. "Warm days followed by bitter cold. The cattle find it confusing." He shifted his weight, adjusting for his stiff knee in the cold. "But by March, the worst is behind us." Eleanor smiled at the simple forecast, at the ordinary nature of their conversation. How strange that discussing weather with this scarred rancher on a moonlit night should feel so comfortable, so right. "Good night, Mr. Donovan," she said softly, "and thank you again." "Matthew," he corrected, his voice barely audible. "When it's just us." "My name is Matthew." The invitation to informal address hung between them, significant in its departure from propriety. Eleanor hesitated, then took the step he offered. "Good night, Matthew. I'm Eleanor." His smile was brief but genuine, transforming his serious face. "Good night, Eleanor. Sleep well." She watched him walk back toward the main house, his tall figure gradually swallowed by the darkness beyond the lantern's glow. Only when he had disappeared entirely did she enter her cabin, closing the door against the cold, but lingering with her hand on the latch, her heart beating with an unfamiliar rhythm. This was dangerous territory, she knew. Developing attachment to this place, to these people, to him, when her position was that of an employee, when her security depended on maintaining appropriate boundaries. And yet, as she moved through her evening routine, preparing for bed in the cozy cabin that was beginning to feel truly hers, Eleanor couldn't help but acknowledge the warmth that had nothing to do with the fire crackling in the hearth. For the first time since the fire that had claimed her family, she felt seen for who she truly was. Not defined by her scars, not pitied for her circumstances, but valued for her capabilities, her resilience, her essential self. Matthew Donovan looked at her and saw Eleanor Mitchell, not a disfigured woman, not a rejected bride, not an object of charity. Just Eleanor, whole and worthy and enough. As she drifted towards sleep beneath the heavy quilts, the wind whistling around the eaves of her small cabin, Eleanor allowed herself to acknowledge a truth she had been avoiding. She was beginning to care for Matthew Donovan, not out of gratitude for his kindness, not out of practical recognition of their similar circumstances, but because of the man himself, his quiet strength, his unflinching honesty, his gentle consideration despite his own hardships. It was a realization both exhilarating and terrifying. Exhilarating because she had thought such feelings beyond her reach after the fire, had resigned herself to practical arrangements and compromised expectations. Terrifying because caring meant vulnerability, and vulnerability had brought her nothing but pain in the years since she had lost her parents. Yet as sleep claimed her, one thought remained. Perhaps here, in this remote ranch with its scarred but undefeated owner, vulnerability might lead to something other than rejection. Perhaps here, finally, she might find not just shelter, but belonging. The first signs of true spring came to Donovan Ranch in early March, the snow retreating from the south-facing slopes to reveal patches of muddy earth beneath. The creek that marked the eastern boundary of the property swelled with meltwater, its banks softening from frozen ridges to pliant soil. With the changing season came new challenges, as Eleanor quickly discovered when Matthew approached her one morning after breakfast. "The carving will begin next week," he said, his voice matter-of-fact but his expression watchful. "We'll need extra hands at all hours. The men will be stretched thin." Eleanor looked up from the ledger where she had been recording the previous day's expenses. "How can I help?" A flicker of approval crossed Matthew's face. "It's difficult work, dirty and sometimes dangerous." "I've assisted with birthing before," she replied. "Calves and foals both on my uncle's farm. I'm stronger than I look." He studied her for a moment as if weighing something in his mind. "The hands usually take shifts in the carving barn, 2 at a time, rotating through the night. But with Jimmy laid up, the young ranch hand had been kicked by a nervous mare. 2 days prior, his arm now splintered and useless for heavy work. "I can take a shift," Eleanor offered. "Just show me what needs to be done." Matthew's scarred mouth twitched into what might have been a smile. "I was hoping you'd say that. Come to the barn after lunch. We'll start your training." Training, as it turned out, was a mild word for the education Eleanor received that afternoon. Matthew led her to the furthest barn, a sturdy structure with a series of stalls and pens designed specifically for the spring calving. Inside, the air was thick with the scent of hay and cattle, warmth emanating from the bodies of a dozen heavily pregnant cows who had been brought in from the pastures in anticipation of their time. "These are the first-time mothers," Matthew explained, leading her down the central aisle. "They need the most watching. The experienced cows can usually manage on their own, but these heifers—" He shook his head. "They panic, sometimes reject the calf, sometimes need help with the birth itself." Eleanor listened intently as he described the signs of imminent labor, the proper positioning of a calf for birth, and the sometimes necessary intervention when things went wrong. His explanations were direct and unvarnished, respecting her intelligence and previous experience while adding the specific knowledge she would need. "The most important thing," he said as they paused before a particularly restless heifer, "is to know when to step in and when to let nature take its course. Intervene too soon, you risk harming both mother and calf. Wait too long." He didn't need to finish the sentence. "How do you know?" Eleanor asked, watching the heifer pace her stall, her swollen sides heaving with each breath. Matthew considered the question seriously. "Experience, partly, but also instinct. You learn to read their eyes, their movements, the sounds they make." He glanced at Eleanor. "You'll develop the sense for it, I have no doubt." The confidence in his statement warmed her more than she cared to admit. "I'll do my best not to disappoint you." "You haven't yet," he said simply, then moved on to demonstrate how to prepare the birthing kits, clean ropes, sharp knives, antiseptic solutions, and soft cloths that would be essential during the coming weeks. By the time they finished the tour and instruction, Eleanor's head was swimming with new information, but a sense of purpose had settled in her chest. This wasn't mere housekeeping or bookkeeping. This was the heart of the ranch's operation, the continuation of life that ensured their shared future. She was being trusted with something precious, and she was determined to prove worthy of that trust. "Your first shift will be tomorrow night," Matthew said as they walked back toward the main house, the late afternoon sun casting long shadows across the yard. 8 until midnight with me. Then Hank will relieve us until dawn." Eleanor nodded, mentally calculating how to adjust her other duties to accommodate the night shift. "I'll be ready." He paused, turning to face her fully. "It won't be easy, the hours are long, the work is messy, and success isn't guaranteed no matter how careful we are." "I understand. Do you?" His gaze was intense, searching. "This isn't like mending shirts or balancing ledgers. When things go wrong in the carving barn, they go wrong quickly and sometimes tragically. Eleanor met his gaze steadily. "I've faced difficult tasks before, Matthew. I may not have your experience, but I have determination and a willingness to learn. I won't shy away from the hard parts." Something softened in his expression. "No, I don't imagine you would." He resumed walking, his limp slightly more pronounced after the long afternoon on his feet. "Just remember that asking for help isn't weakness. It's wisdom." "I'll remember," she promised, though the lesson ran contrary to everything life had taught her. Since the fire, she had learned to rely solely on herself, to expect neither assistance nor compassion from others. Matthew Donovan's straightforward offer of support was still unfamiliar territory, a map she was learning to read with cautious hope. That night, as Eleanor prepared for bed in her cabin, she found herself reviewing Matthew's instructions, mentally rehearsing the steps for assisting a difficult birth. The responsibility weighed on her, but not unpleasantly. Rather, it felt like recognition of her capabilities, an acknowledgement that she was more than her scars or her circumstances. Sleep came fitfully, her dreams filled with lowing cattle and the imagined cries of newborn calves. She woke before dawn, her mind already racing with the day ahead. Beyond her window, the sky was just beginning to lighten, the stars fading into the pale blue of early morning. In the distance, she could see a figure moving near the carving barn, Matthew, already at work despite the early hour. The day passed in a blur of ordinary tasks, made extraordinary by the anticipation of the night to come. Eleanor swept and dusted the main house, helped Maria prepare meals for the ranch hands, and spent an hour updating the ledger with recent expenses. But her thoughts continually drifted to the carving barn and the trust Matthew had placed in her. By evening, she was almost relieved when the time finally came to walk to the barn, a lantern in hand to guide her way through the deepening twilight. The air held the crisp chill of early spring, but without winter's biting edge. Birds called their last songs before settling for the night, and somewhere in the distance, a coyote yipped to its pack. Matthew was already in the barn when she arrived, moving between the stalls with the careful efficiency she had come to associate with him. He looked up at her entrance, nodding in acknowledgement. "Right on time," he said, straightening from where he had been examining a heifer. "We have two that might deliver tonight. This one," he gestured to the animal he'd been checking, "and the spotted one in the third stall. Both first-timers, both showing the early signs." Eleanor hung her coat on a peg by the door and rolled up her sleeves. "What would you like me to do?" "For now, observe, learn their patterns, their normal behaviors. That way you'll notice when something changes." He indicated a stool near the center aisle. "We watch in shifts. One rests while the other monitors. 4 hours goes faster than you might think, but also slower." Eleanor took the seat, setting her lantern on a nearby shelf. The barn was warmer than outside, heated by the bodies of the cattle and the thick layer of straw that covered the floor. The smell was not unpleasant, earthy and alive, a reminder of the cycle of seasons and birth that had continued unbroken on this land long before human settlement. Matthew took up position on a bale of hay across from her, his scarred face half in shadow from the lantern light. For a while, they sat in companionable silence, listening to the soft rustling of the cattle, the occasional snort or low moan. "Tell me about your uncle's farm," Matthew said eventually, his voice low so as not to disturb the animals. "Was it large?" Eleanor shook her head. "Small by Montana standards, 40 acres of mixed cultivation, wheat, corn, some vegetables for market. A few horses, a dozen cattle at most. Nothing like this, but enough to learn the essentials." "Yes," she agreed. "My uncle wasn't a patient teacher, but necessity is instructive in its own way." Matthew nodded, understanding in his gaze. "Your cousins helped with the work as well." "My cousins were young when I arrived, just boys. They worked in the fields with their father, while I helped my aunt with the household and livestock." Eleanor, brushed a strand of hair from her face. After my aunt died and my uncle remarried, things changed. His new wife had her own ideas about household management. And you became superfluous, Matthew observed quietly. Eleanor's hands stilled in her lap. Yes, she had 2 daughters from her previous marriage. The farm couldn't support us all, and I was... She hesitated, then finished honestly. I was a reminder of unpleasant things. My mother was my uncle's sister. My scars reminded him of her loss. Matthew was silent for a moment, his scarred hand resting on his knee. People fear what reminds them of their own mortality, their own fragility. It's easier to look away. The simple truth of his statement settled between them. Eleanor had never considered her uncle's rejection in those terms, had always assumed it was disgust or disappointment that had made him arrange her marriage to a stranger. But perhaps it had been fear all along, fear of what had happened to her family, fear that such tragedy might befall his own. It's their loss, Matthew said, his voice firmer now. Those who can't see past the surface. Before Eleanor could respond, a sharp movement from the spotted heifer caught her attention. The cow had been lying quietly in her stall, but now lurched to her feet, turning in an awkward circle before dropping back down to the straw with a low groan. Matthew was immediately alert, rising from his seat. It's starting. Come, watch closely. Eleanor followed him to the stall, her heart quickening. The heifer was clearly uncomfortable, her sides heaving, her large eyes rolling with uncertainty. Early labor, Matthew explained, keeping his voice soothing and low. See how she's restless, can't get comfortable? Her body is positioning the calf for birth. For the next hour, they observed the heifer's increasing discomfort, Matthew pointing out the signs of progression as Eleanor absorbed every detail. By the time the water broke, indicating the imminent arrival of the calf, she felt both nervous and exhilarated. Now we watch carefully, Matthew said, his gaze never leaving the laboring animal. If we see the nose and front hooves emerging together, all is well. If not, we intervene. Eleanor held her breath as the heifer strained, her powerful body working to bring new life into the world. The first glimpse of the calf appeared, a small hoof glistening in the lantern light. There's one, Matthew murmured. Now we need to see the second and the nose. Minutes passed, the heifer's efforts intensifying, but no further progress was made. The single hoof remained, partially emerged, but nothing more. Matthew's expression grew increasingly concerned. Something's wrong, he said finally. The position is off. I need to check. With efficient movements, he washed his hands and forearms in a bucket of antiseptic solution they had prepared earlier, then carefully approached the straining heifer. Speaking softly to the distressed animal, he eased his hand into the birth canal, his face concentrating as he felt for the problem. The second leg is back, he reported, his voice calm despite the seriousness of the situation. The calf can't come out this way. We need to reposition it. Eleanor moved closer, ready to assist. What do you need me to do? Keep her head steady. Talk to her. I need to push the calf back slightly to get room to bring that leg forward. For the next 20 minutes, Eleanor witnessed Matthew's skilled intervention, his damaged hands working with surprising dexterity as he maneuvered the unborn calf into the proper position for birth. Despite the urgency, his movements remained calm and deliberate, his voice a steady stream of reassurance to the frightened heifer. There, he said finally, withdrawing his hands. Try again, Mama. Your little one's ready now. As if understanding his words, the heifer renewed her efforts, and this time 2 hooves appeared, followed by a small nose and head. Within minutes, the calf slid into the world in a rush of fluid and membrane, landing on the soft straw with a wet thump. A heifer calf, Matthew announced, his voice holding a note of satisfaction Eleanor had never heard before. And a good size, too. The mother cow turned to her newborn, lowing softly as she began to lick the membrane from the calf's body. The small creature lay stunned for a moment, then jerked as life fully claimed it, its skinny legs kicking in first. Attempts at coordination. Eleanor found herself smiling, a deep sense of wonder filling her chest. She's beautiful. Matthew glanced at her, something warm in his gaze. Your first calving, and it's a success. That's a good omen. Thanks to your intervention, Eleanor pointed out, I did nothing but watch. Watching is the first step to learning, he replied, moving to wash his hands in fresh water. Next time you'll do more. The rest of their shift passed without further births, though the second heifer Matthew had identified continued to show signs of early labor. When midnight came and Hank arrived to relieve them, Eleanor was surprised at how quickly the hours had passed. Congratulations on the new arrival, Hank said, nodding toward the stall where mother and calf rested peacefully. First of the season is always special. Eleanor was a quick study, Matthew said, gathering their supplies. Natural instincts for the work. The simple praise warmed her as they walked back to the main house together, the night silent around them, except for the distant chorus of spring peepers beginning their seasonal songs from the creek. Thank you for trusting me with this, she said as they approached the point where their paths would diverge, Matthew to the main house, Eleanor to her cabin in the orchard. He stopped, turning to face her in the moonlight. You've earned my trust. Many times over, Eleanor. Not just tonight, but every day since you arrived. The sincerity in his voice caught her off guard. I've only done what was asked of me. You've done far more than that. His scarred face was solemn in the silvery light. You've brought life back to this ranch in ways that have nothing to do with cattle or crops. Eleanor's heart quickened at his words, at the intensity behind them. Matthew, get some rest, he said, suddenly brisk again. Tomorrow brings more of the same. Calving season waits for no one, not even those who've been up half the night. With that, he nodded and turned toward the main house, leaving Eleanor to walk the remaining distance to her cabin alone, her mind replaying his words and the look in his eyes when he'd spoken them. The following days established a new rhythm to life on Donovan Ranch. The calving began in earnest, with sometimes 3 or 4 births in a single night. Eleanor quickly progressed from observer to active participant, her hands steadying nervous heifers, guiding wobbly newborns to their mother's sides, assisting Matthew and the other ranch hands as needed. The work was exhausting and sometimes heartbreaking, as not every birth ended in success. Eleanor learned the harsh reality of ranch life when a breech position claimed both mother and calf despite their best efforts. She had wept then, privately, in her cabin, for the lives they couldn't save. But she returned to the barn the next evening, determined to learn from the loss, to be better prepared next time. Matthew noticed her red-rimmed eyes, but said nothing directly. Instead, he spent extra time showing her how to identify potential problems earlier, how to feel for the position of an unborn calf, how to know when immediate action was required. His patience never wavered, even when her questions revealed her inexperience. You're doing well, he told her one evening as they walked back from a successful delivery. Better than most who've been raised to this life. Eleanor shook her head. I still have so much to learn. Learning never stops, he replied simply. Not for any of us. By the end of the second week, Eleanor could identify the signs of imminent birth with accuracy, could differentiate between normal labor and potential complications, and had successfully assisted with over a dozen deliveries. Her confidence grew with each successful birth, as did the ranch hand's respect for her abilities. Even Hank, who had initially regarded her with polite skepticism, now deferred to her judgment when they shared shifts. Miss Eleanor's got the touch, she overheard him telling Jimmy one morning. Calmer than most men I've worked with and twice as observant. The praise, unexpected and sincere, bolstered her resolve during the long nights and exhausting days. Between her regular duties and the carving shifts, Eleanor had little time for rest, but she found the work deeply satisfying. Each healthy calf represented the ranch's future. Each successful birth, a small victory against the many challenges nature presented. Most rewarding, however, was the growing partnership between her and Matthew. In the carving barn, they developed a wordless communication, a glance, a nod, a particular positioning that conveyed volumes without speech. They moved together with increasing synchronicity, anticipating each other's needs, complementing each other's strengths. Matthew's scarred left hand sometimes struggled with fine manipulation, but his knowledge and instincts were unerring. Eleanor's smaller hands could reach where his could not, her patience calming nervous mothers when more forceful approaches failed. Together, they saved calves that might otherwise have been lost, guided inexperienced heifers through their first motherhood, and ensured the ranch's herd would thrive into the next season. "We make a good team," Matthew observed one night after. A particularly difficult delivery had ended in success. They were sitting on the edge of the empty stall, catching their breath before making final rounds of the barn. Eleanor smiled, exhaustion and satisfaction mingling as she wiped her hands on a clean cloth. "We do," she agreed, "though I'm still learning from you every day." "And I from you," he countered, surprising her. "Your approach with the nervous mothers, I've never seen anything like it. You have a gift for calming them." She hadn't expected the compliment and felt warmth rise to her cheeks. "I just try to imagine what they're feeling. The fear and confusion of a first birth, the pain without understanding. It helps to speak softly, to move slowly and predictably." Matthew studied her, his expression thoughtful. Empathy is rare in this work. Most ranch hands focus on the task, not the creature's experience. "Does that make me unsuitable?" Eleanor asked, suddenly uncertain. "No," he replied firmly. "It makes you exceptional." The word hung between them, weighted with meaning beyond its simple definition. Eleanor looked away first, unsure how to respond to the admiration in his voice. "We should check the others before Hank arrives," she said, rising from her seat. Matthew nodded, accepting the change of subject. The red heifer in the last stall looked restless earlier. She might be starting. They fell back into the familiar pattern of their work, moving from stall to stall, checking each animal with practiced efficiency. But something had shifted between them, a recognition that hadn't been there before. Eleanor could feel it in the way Matthew's gaze lingered when he thought she wasn't looking, in the careful distance he maintained even as they worked side by side. By the time Hank arrived to relieve them, the red heifer was indeed in early labor, but not yet requiring intervention. They briefed him on her condition and the status of the other cattle before gathering their coats for the walk back. Outside, spring had progressed during their weeks of intense focus on the carving barn. The trees in the orchard showed the first pale green of budding leaves, and clumps of early wildflowers dotted the edges of the path. The night air carried the scent of awakening earth and growing things, a welcome change from the close atmosphere of the barn. "Would you like to see something?" Matthew asked as they neared the fork in the path where they would usually separate. "It's not far, just beyond your cabin." Curiosity overcame Eleanor's fatigue. Of course. He led her past her cabin, through the sleeping orchard where apple trees stood like sentinels in the moonlight, their branches still bare but expectant. Beyond, the land sloped gently downward toward the creek that marked the eastern boundary of the ranch. As they approached, Eleanor heard the rush of water, much stronger than the gentle burble she had grown accustomed to during her daily walks. "The spring melt is in full force," Matthew explained, guiding her to a clearing where the creek widened into a small pool before continuing its journey southward. "This happens every year, but it's different each time. In the moonlight, the scene was breathtaking. The creek, swollen with snowmelt from the distant mountains, tumbled over rocks with joyous abandon, creating a natural music that filled the clearing. The pool reflected the star-filled sky, occasionally disturbed by the splash of what might have been fish or perhaps frogs awakening from winter dormancy. "It's beautiful," Eleanor breathed, the exhaustion of the long night temporarily forgotten. "My father used to bring us here, Thomas and me, when we were boys," Matthew said, his voice holding a rare note of reminiscence. He said the spring melt was a reminder that even the harshest winter eventually yields to new life. Eleanor glanced at him, touched by the shared memory. A wise perspective. He was a wise man. Matthew's gaze remained on the flowing water. Simple in his way, but understanding of the larger patterns. He built this ranch, knowing he might not see it reach its full potential, but believing his sons would. "He would be proud of what you've accomplished," Eleanor said softly. Matthew's scarred mouth curved in a faint smile. "Perhaps, though I think he would value more the fact that life continues here." He gestured toward the creek, the awakening land. That's what he truly built, not just structures or herds, but a place where life could flourish season after season. Eleanor understood then, with sudden clarity, why the calving season meant so much to Matthew. It wasn't just about the economic value of the new cattle, or even the satisfaction of successful births. It was continuation, proof that the cycle his father had established remained unbroken, despite fire and loss and change. "Thank you for showing me this," she said, her voice quiet against the backdrop of rushing water. "And for trusting me to help with the carving. I know how important it is to you, to the ranch." Matthew turned to her then, his expression open in a way she'd rarely seen it. "You've become important to the ranch as well, Eleanor. More than you know." The words carried weight far beyond their simple meaning, touching something deep within her that had been carefully guarded since the fire that had claimed her family. For so long, she had defined herself by what she had lost: parents, beauty, prospects. Now, standing beside this scarred man in the moonlight, she felt herself being defined instead by what she had gained: purpose, respect, belonging. "The ranch has become important to me too," she replied, holding his gaze. It was both truth and understatement, but all she dared offer in this moment of fragile connection. Understanding passed between them, acknowledgement of feelings neither was yet ready to name. Then Matthew nodded, accepting the boundary she had set. "We should get back. Morning comes early, and you need rest." As they walked back through the orchard, their path lit by moonlight filtering through the budding branches, Eleanor sensed that something fundamental had shifted between them. Like the creek transformed by spring melt, what had been frozen was beginning to flow, carving new channels through familiar landscape. Whether that transformation would lead to destruction or renewal remained to be seen. But as Matthew bid her goodnight at her cabin door, his scarred face gentle in the silver light, Eleanor found herself hoping, for the first time in many years, that change might bring something beautiful in its wake. April brought a profusion of wildflowers to the hills surrounding Donovan Ranch, painting the landscape in vibrant purples, yellows, and blues after the monochrome months of winter. The calving season was winding down, with only a few late mothers still awaiting their time in the barn. The majority of the new calves now frolicked in the lush spring pastures, their spindly legs growing stronger each day. For Eleanor, the transition from constant urgency to a more measured pace brought both relief and a curious emptiness. The intense weeks of shared purpose with Matthew had created a bond she hadn't anticipated, one built on mutual respect and unspoken understanding. Now, as the ranch's rhythm shifted towards spring planting and fence mending, she found herself seeing less of him during daylight hours. "He's always like this come planting time," Maria explained one morning as they kneaded. Bread dough side by side in the kitchen, dawn to dusk in the fields, checking soil conditions, planning which sections get planted when. The hands joke that he barely sleeps during April and May. Eleanor nodded, trying not to reveal her disappointment at Matthew's recent absence. The ranch requires constant attention. I understand that. Maria's knowing eyes missed nothing. She murmured, neither agreement nor disagreement. Still, a man needs more than work to sustain him. Before Eleanor could respond to this pointed observation, the kitchen door opened and Sheriff Jim Parker stepped inside, removing his hat with a polite nod to the women. Morning, ladies. Hope I'm not interrupting. Sheriff, Maria acknowledged him, wiping flour from her hands. Matthew's out in the north field if you're looking for him. Actually, the sheriff said, his gaze shifting to Eleanor. I was hoping to speak with Miss Mitchell. Eleanor's hands stilled in the dough. Me, is something wrong? Not wrong exactly. The sheriff's weathered face was carefully neutral. Just some information that's come to my attention that I thought you should know. Maria immediately took the dough from Eleanor's hands. Use the study, she said, gesturing toward the small room off the main hallway where Matthew kept the ranch records. I'll bring coffee. The sheriff waited until they were seated in the privacy of the study, the door closed against curious ears, before speaking again. Miss Mitchell, I received a telegram yesterday from a lawyer in Helena. He's been making inquiries about you on behalf of a Mr. Edward Caldwell. Eleanor felt her stomach tighten. I see. What sort of inquiries? Nothing alarming, Sheriff Parker assured her. Just confirmation that you're residing at Donovan Ranch and working as the housekeeper. But I thought you should know. Folks in town talk and word gets around. Has Mr. Caldwell indicated why he's looking for this information? Eleanor kept her voice steady, despite the unease growing within her. The sheriff shook his head. The telegram didn't say, but given the circumstances of your arrival in Willow Creek, he hesitated, clearly uncomfortable with the topic. You mean my rejection by the Caldwells? Eleanor stated plainly. There's no need to be delicate, Sheriff. It's a matter of public knowledge. He nodded, appreciating her directness. Yes, well, I found it curious that after dismissing you so abruptly, they're now taking pains to locate you. Eleanor considered this information carefully. The Caldwells had made their opinion of her abundantly clear that snowy night in January. What possible reason could they have for seeking her out now? Thank you for informing me, she said finally. I appreciate your discretion. Of course. The sheriff accepted the coffee Maria brought in, taking an appreciative sip before continuing. Miss Mitchell, if I may speak plainly, please do. You've made quite an impression these past months. Maria here tells anyone who'll listen how you've transformed the ranch's bookkeeping, and Jimmy can't say enough about your skill with the carving. He set his cup down carefully. Folks in town have noticed the change in Matthew too. He's more present, more engaged with the community than he's been since the fire. Eleanor felt heat rise to her cheeks. I'm simply doing the job I was hired to do. The sheriff's gaze was kind, but penetrating. We both know it's more than that, which is why I wanted to warn you personally about these inquiries. Whatever the Caldwells want, I doubt it's in the best interest of what you've built here. The implications of his statement hung in the air between them. Eleanor was touched by his concern, by the tacit acknowledgement that she had found a place in this community despite her inauspicious arrival. I'll be careful, she promised, and I'll inform Matthew when he returns this evening. After the sheriff departed, Eleanor tried to resume her normal duties, but her mind kept returning to the puzzling news. Why would Edward Caldwell or his formidable mother have any interest in her whereabouts now? The question nagged at her throughout. The day, distracting her from tasks that had become second nature over the past months. By late afternoon, she had made a decision. Instead of waiting for Matthew to return for the evening meal, she would ride out to the north field and speak with him directly. The matter felt too important to delay, and truthfully, she welcomed the excuse to seek him out after days of limited interaction. Eleanor had become a competent rider during her time at the ranch, another skill Matthew had patiently taught her during the quieter moments between carving emergencies. She saddled the gentle mare that had become her regular mount, secured her hat against the spring breeze, and set out toward the northern section of the property. The ride was pleasant, the land vibrant with new growth after the long winter. Eleanor followed the well-worn trail that led through a small copse of aspen trees, their leaves shimmering like coins in the afternoon light, then up a gradual rise that offered a view of the surrounding countryside. From this vantage point, she could see the patchwork of Donovan Ranch spread before her, pastures where cattle grazed, fields waiting for planting, the snaking line of the creek that divided the property, and in the distance, the mountains still, capped with snow despite the spring warmth. It was beautiful in a way that Philadelphia's ordered streets and her uncle's modest farm had never been, wild and expansive, challenging and rewarding in equal measure. Like Matthew himself, Eleanor thought, then quickly pushed the comparison aside. She spotted him at the edge of a large field, standing beside his horse as he examined the soil, occasionally making notes in a small book he carried. Even at a distance, his tall figure was unmistakable, as was the careful way he moved, always compensating for the stiffness in his left side. Eleanor guided her mare toward him, feeling a flutter of nervous anticipation that had nothing to do with the news she carried. It had been this way for weeks now, this awareness of him as more than her employer, more than a partner in work. She had tried to dismiss it as gratitude or simple friendship, but in quiet moments of honesty with herself, she knew it was neither. He looked up at the sound of approaching hoofbeats, surprise and then pleasure registering on his scarred face as he recognized her. "Eleanor." He straightened, tucking his notebook into his coat pocket. "Is everything all right?" She dismounted, leading her mare the final few steps to where he stood. "Nothing urgent, but Sheriff Parker paid a visit this morning. I thought you should know right away." Concern immediately replaced the warmth in his expression. "What did he want?" Eleanor explained the sheriff's message about the inquiries from Helena, watching Matthew's face grow increasingly serious as she spoke. "Edward Caldwell," he said when she had finished, the name sounding like a curse on his lips. "What could he possibly want now?" "I've been asking myself the same question all day," Eleanor admitted. "It makes no sense. Mrs. Caldwell made her opinion of me very clear." Matthew's jaw tightened, the scar tissue along his cheek whitening slightly with the tension. "People like the Caldwells always want something. The question is what?" He began pacing, his limp more pronounced in the uneven ground of the field. Eleanor had learned this was his way when troubled. Movement helping him think through problems that couldn't be solved with immediate action. "Whatever it is," he said finally, turning back to her, "I want you to be careful. The Caldwells have influence in this territory. Edward's position at the bank gives him access to information most people don't have." "The sheriff seemed to think the same," Eleanor said. "He mentioned that folks in town had noticed changes at the ranch, and in you." Matthew went still, his good eye searching her face. "What sort of changes?" Eleanor hesitated, suddenly aware of how personal the conversation had become. "He said you've been more engaged with the community, that people have noticed." A complicated expression crossed Matthew's features, part discomfort, part something softer that Eleanor couldn't quite identify. "People notice all manner of things," he said finally. "It doesn't mean they understand what they're seeing." The statement felt weighted with meaning beyond the immediate context, but before Eleanor could respond, a distant rumble of thunder interrupted the moment. They both looked up to see dark clouds gathering on the western horizon, moving quickly toward them on the spring wind. "Storm's coming," Matthew observed, immediately practical again. "We should get back to the house." They mounted their horses and set off at a brisk pace, trying to outrun the approaching weather. The air had cooled noticeably, carrying the metallic scent that preceded heavy rain. They had just reached the edge of the aspen grove when the first large drops began to fall, quickly intensifying into a downpour. "This way," Matthew called over the increasing roar of rain and wind. "There's a line shack just beyond these trees. We can wait it out there." Eleanor followed him through the grove to a small, sturdy cabin she hadn't known existed. Matthew dismounted quickly, leading both horses to a lean-to shelter attached to the side of the structure. Eleanor joined him, helping to secure the animals. Before they ducked into the cabin, just as a brilliant flash of lightning illuminated the landscape, followed immediately by a deafening crack of thunder. "Spring storms?" Matthew said as he closed the door against the deluge. "Violent, but usually short-lived." The interior of the cabin was simple but well-maintained. A single room with a small wood stove, a narrow cot against one wall, a rough-hewn table with 2 chairs, and basic supplies stored on shelves. It was clean and dry, clearly checked regularly as part of the ranch's maintenance routine. "The line riders use this during roundup," Matthew explained, moving to the stove. "And sometimes I come here when work keeps me in the north section. Overnight." He began arranging kindling and small logs in the firebox. "It should be comfortable enough until the storm passes." Eleanor removed her dripping hat and coat, hanging them on pegs by the door. Her dress had mostly been protected, but her hair had come partially loose from its pins, damp tendrils curling around her face. She was suddenly acutely aware of the intimacy of their situation. Alone in this small cabin, miles from the main house, with no certainty of when the storm would abate. Matthew seemed to realize it at the same moment, his movements becoming more deliberate as he lit the fire, careful to maintain a respectful distance between them in the confined space. "You should sit by the stove," he said, gesturing to one of the chairs as the fire caught and began to spread welcome warmth through the cabin. "You're shivering." Eleanor hadn't noticed until he mentioned it, but it was true. Her hands trembled slightly as she moved to the chair. "Thank you," she said, extending her palms toward the growing heat. "I didn't realize how cold the rain was." Matthew remained standing, his tall frame seeming too large for the small cabin. "Would you like coffee? There should be supplies here." "That would be wonderful," she replied, grateful for the practical suggestion that might ease the sudden tension between them. He busied himself with preparations, finding coffee and a pot stored on the shelves, adding water from a container kept specifically for this purpose. His movements were efficient, despite the stiffness in his left hand, revealing his familiarity with these tasks, even in less than ideal circumstances. Outside, the storm continued unabated, rain lashing against the small windows, wind howling. Around the eaves of the cabin, occasional flashes of lightning illuminated the interior with stark white light, followed by rumbling thunder that seemed to shake the very ground beneath them. "It's getting worse," Eleanor observed, as Matthew placed the coffee pot on the stove to heat. He nodded, glancing toward the windows. "The season's first major storm. It's been building for days." A particularly violent gust of wind rattled the door, making Eleanor jump slightly. Matthew gave her a reassuring look. "The cabin has weathered worse. My father built it 30 years ago, and it's still standing." "Your father seems to have built things to last," Eleanor said, thinking of the main house, the barns, the entire carefully planned layout of the ranch. "He did." Matthew's voice held quiet pride. "He believed in building for the future, not just the present." "Tell me about him," Eleanor requested, genuinely curious about the man who had created this legacy, who had shaped the son now standing before her. Matthew seemed surprised by the question, but after a moment's consideration, he pulled the second chair closer to the stove and sat down. My father came west with nothing but determination and a talent for working with cattle, he began, his gaze fixed on the dancing flames visible through the stove's small window. He worked as a hand on other men's ranches until he saved enough to buy this land. It wasn't much then, just open country with the creek running through it. Eleanor listened, captivated by this glimpse into the history that had preceded her. Arrival. When was that? 1857, before the territory was even properly organized. A faint smile touched Matthew's scarred mouth. He lived in a tent that first summer while he built the line shacks. The main house came later, after he'd established enough of a herd to know the land would support them. And your mother? She came 2 years later, daughter of a shopkeeper in Virginia who'd advertised for a wife. His gaze flickered to Eleanor's face. Not so different from your situation, except that my father traveled east to meet her first, to make sure they suited before bringing her to such a remote place. The parallel wasn't lost on Eleanor. Edward Caldwell had made no such effort, content to judge her solely by her letters without revealing the true authority in his household, his mother. They built the ranch together then, she said, steering away from the uncomfortable comparison. Matthew nodded. Every part of it. My mother was as skilled with the ledger as my father was with cattle. She taught me to read using the ranch accounts. His expression softened with memory. She would have liked you, I think. The simple statement warmed Eleanor more than the fire before them. I would have liked to meet her. She was practical, like you, no patience for pretense or false sentiment. The coffee pot began to steam, and Matthew rose to check it. But compassionate too. The hands used to say she could heal just about anything with her remedies and common sense. He poured the coffee into 2 tin cups, handing one to Eleanor before returning to his seat. The rich aroma filled the small space, creating an atmosphere of surprising comfort despite the storm raging outside. And your brother? Eleanor asked, after taking an appreciative sip. Thomas seems very different from you, based on what Maria has said. A complex expression crossed Matthew's face, affection mingled with exasperation. Thomas takes after our mother's side, restless, always looking toward the horizon. He shook his head slightly. He's a good man, but this life, the day-to-day work of the ranch, it chafes him. Will he return from delivering those horses? Eventually. Matthew's tone suggested this was a pattern rather than a certainty. When the mood strikes him, or when he runs out of money, whichever comes first. Eleanor considered this, thinking of her own experience with family, the uncle who had taken her in out of obligation rather than affection, the cousins who had quickly learned to avoid looking at her scarred face. It must be difficult, carrying the ranch alone when it was meant to be a shared legacy. Matthew studied her over the rim of his coffee cup, his gaze thoughtful. You understand better than most would. Perhaps, she acknowledged, though my burden was only myself, yours is all of this. She gestured toward the window, indicating the vast ranch beyond. It's not a burden, he corrected gently. It's a purpose. The simple statement resonated deeply with Eleanor. Purpose. Wasn't that what she had been seeking when she answered Edward Caldwell's advertisement? Not just security or shelter, but meaning, a reason to continue beyond mere survival. Yes, she said softly. I think I understand that now. Something shifted in Matthew's expression, a subtle change that nonetheless transformed his scarred features. You've brought purpose back to this place, Eleanor. To me. The words hung between them, heavy with implication. Eleanor felt her heartbeat, quicken, aware that they were approaching territory neither had dared acknowledge directly before this moment. Matthew. Before she could continue, a tremendous crack split the air. Not thunder, but the unmistakable sound of wood giving way under stress. The next instant, a massive branch crashed onto the roof of the cabin, sending splinters of wood and dust raining down from the ceiling. Matthew was on his feet immediately, moving to Eleanor's side with surprising speed, despite his limp. "Are you all right?" She nodded, shaken but unhurt. "Yes, but the roof..." He glanced up, assessing the damage. Rain was already beginning to drip through in several places where the impact had damaged the shingles and underlying structure. "We need to move away from this side," he said, taking her elbow and guiding her toward the area near the cot, which appeared intact. "The main beams are still holding, but I don't want to risk another branch coming down on the same spot." Eleanor allowed him to lead her to safety, acutely aware of his hand on her arm, the protective stance he had instinctively adopted. Even injured, even with his own mobility impaired, his first thought had been for her welfare. "The horses," she remembered suddenly. "Are they safe?" "The lean-to is on the other side, away from the trees," Matthew assured her, releasing her arm once they were in the safer portion of the cabin. "But I should check to make sure." Before Eleanor could protest, he had moved to the door, opening it against the force of the wind to peer outside. Rain immediately blew in, soaking his shirt as he confirmed that the horses were indeed unharmed. When he closed the door and turned back to her, water streamed from his hair down his scarred face. "They're fine," he reported, pushing wet hair back from his forehead. "Nervous but secure." Eleanor retrieved a rough towel from the supplies on the shelf, bringing it to him. "Here, you're drenched." He accepted it with a nod of thanks, drying his face and hair as best he could. The cabin had grown noticeably cooler, with the damaged roof now admitting both rain and wind. More concerning, the water was beginning to pool on the floor, spreading toward the stove where their fire provided the only heat. "We need to redirect that water," Matthew said, eyeing the growing puddle, "or we'll lose the fire." Together, they fashioned a makeshift channel using items from the cabin's supplies, tin plates, a folded tarp, anything that could guide the water away from the stove and toward the door instead. It was imperfect but functional, allowing them to maintain the precious warmth of the fire as the storm continued its assault. By the time they had done all they could to protect their shelter, both were damp and chilled despite their efforts. Matthew added more wood to the stove, building the fire higher to combat the invading cold. "I'm sorry about this," he said, straightening from his task with a slight wince that didn't escape Eleanor's notice. "I meant to provide shelter, not another ordeal." "It's hardly your fault that a branch fell," she replied. "And this is still far better than being caught in the open." He conceded the point with a nod, but his expression remained troubled as he surveyed the damaged cabin. "Still, I should have anticipated the danger. These aspens are old, many weakened by disease. I've been meaning to have them cleared." "Matthew," Eleanor interrupted gently, "you can't anticipate every danger, control every circumstance. No, one can." He looked at her then, really looked at her, as if seeing something new in her face. "That's a difficult lesson for a man who's built his life around doing exactly that." "I know," she said simply. "I've been learning it too." Understanding passed between them, silent but profound. They had both tried to control their circumstances in different ways. Matthew through sheer determination and ceaseless work, Eleanor through careful compliance with others' expectations. Both had been burned, literally and figuratively, and both were now finding their way toward something new. "You're shivering again," Matthew observed, concern replacing introspection. "Your dress is damp from our repairs." Eleanor glanced down, realizing he was right. The hem of her skirt was soaked, and her sleeves had become wet while they worked to channel the water. "I'll be fine. It will dry by the fire." But Matthew was already moving to a trunk in the corner of the cabin, opening it to reveal spare Clothing kept for emergencies. He extracted a flannel shirt and wool trousers, both far too large for her, but dry. "It's not proper," he acknowledged, bringing the clothing to her. "But hypothermia is a greater danger than impropriety out here. You can change behind the blanket." He indicated the rough wool blanket folded at the foot of the cot. Eleanor hesitated, weighing conventional modesty against practical need. The chill was seeping into her bones, and the storm showed no signs of abating soon. With a decisive nod, she accepted the clothing. "Thank you. I'll be quick." Matthew turned his back, busying himself with the fire, as Eleanor strung the blanket across a corner of the cabin, creating a small private area. With fingers stiff from cold, she unfastened her damp dress, replacing it with the oversized shirt and trousers. The men's clothing felt strange against her skin, but the dry warmth was immediate and welcome. "You can turn around now," she called softly when she was decent again. Matthew glanced over his shoulder, a flicker of something indefinable, crossing his face at the sight of her in the borrowed clothes. The flannel shirt hung nearly to her knees, the sleeves rolled up multiple times to free her hands, while the trousers were secured at her waist with a length of rope she had found in the supplies. "Better?" he asked, his voice slightly rough. Eleanor nodded, returning to her seat by the stove. "Much, thank you." Matthew had hung her dress near the fire to dry, the gesture practical yet oddly intimate. He remained standing, as if uncertain of his place now that the immediate problems had been addressed. "You should sit," Eleanor suggested. "Your knee must be paining you after all that." She had never directly mentioned his injury before, maintaining the polite fiction that his limp was insignificant. But after months of working alongside him, of noticing how the end of each day found him moving more carefully, how cold and damp weather increased his discomfort, it seemed disingenuous to pretend ignorance now. Surprise registered on his face, followed by a rueful acknowledgement. "It protests on days like this," he admitted, lowering himself to the second chair, "though I try not to let it dictate what needs doing. There's a difference between letting pain dictate your actions and acknowledging its existence," Eleanor said gently. "One is surrender, the other is simply truth." Matthew regarded her thoughtfully. "You're a wise woman, Eleanor Mitchell." "Not wise," she corrected, "just experienced in certain matters." His gaze lingered on the scarred side of her face, not with the discomfort or pity she had grown accustomed to from others, but with genuine understanding. "Your scars pain you still." The directness of the question might have offended her coming from anyone else, but from Matthew, it felt like an offering, an acknowledgement of their shared experience that neither needed to hide from the other. "Sometimes," she answered honestly, "in cold weather especially, and there's a tightness that never quite goes away." She touched her cheek lightly, where the scarred tissue pulled slightly at the corner of her eye. "But it's more the memory of pain that persists, I think. The body remembers what the mind would prefer to forget." Matthew nodded slowly. "Yes, exactly that." He flexed his left hand unconsciously, the motion slightly restricted by the damaged tendons. The doctor said the physical pain would fade with time. He didn't mention the other kind. "The kind that wakes you in the night," Eleanor said softly. "That makes you relive the moment again and again." "Yes." His voice was equally quiet. "Do you dream of it still? The fire?" Eleanor looked into the dancing flames of the stove, seeing instead the consuming blaze that had claimed her childhood home. "Less often now. But yes, sometimes." "What do you see in the dreams?" The question was tentative, as if he wasn't certain. He had the right to ask, but needed to know. Eleanor took a deep breath, considering. She had never spoken of her nightmares, not to her uncle or his wife, certainly not to the succession of doctors who had treated her burns. But here, in this storm-battered cabin with this man who carried his own scars, the words came more easily than she would have imagined. "I see my mother," she said slowly, reaching for me through the smoke. "I hear my father calling my name, but I can't find him, and then the ceiling falls." She swallowed hard. "I always wake before I feel the burns, but somehow that's worse. Knowing what comes next, but being unable to prevent it, night after night." Matthew's expression held, a depth of understanding that no sympathy from unburned people could ever match. "For me, it's the sound," he said after a moment, "the roar of it, like a living thing, hungry and merciless." Eleanor nodded. "And the smell, that's what comes back most clearly when I'm awake. Smoke and something else. Something that was never meant to burn," Matthew finished for her. "Wood and hay, yes, but also flesh, our flesh." The stark truth hung between them, neither flinching from it. In that moment, Eleanor felt a connection deeper than any she had experienced since. The fire, a recognition that went beyond words or even shared experience. Matthew Donovan truly understood. Not just the physical pain and disfigurement, but the deeper marks the fire had left on her spirit. "How do you bear it?" she asked, the question encompassing far more than the nightmares. "How do you continue when so much has been taken?" Matthew considered this, his scarred face solemn in the firelight. "One day at a time, by finding purpose in what remains, rather than dwelling on what was lost." His gaze met hers, direct and unwavering. "And by allowing new things to matter, even when that feels like a risk." The implications of his words settled around Eleanor, like a mantle, both comforting and weighty with responsibility. "New things," she repeated softly, "like this ranch, this life." "Like you," he said simply. The admission, plainly stated yet profound in its meaning, caught Eleanor's breath in her throat. They had been circling this truth for weeks, perhaps, since that first night when he had found her outside the general store, a stranger with familiar pain in her eyes. "Matthew," she began, uncertain what would follow his name, but knowing she needed to respond to his honesty with her own. Before she could continue, the cabin door burst open with a gust of wind and rain. Both turned in shock to see a figure, silhouetted in the doorway, tall, broad-shouldered, and distinctly familiar despite being drenched to the skin. "Well now," said a voice that held echoes of Matthew's but with a warmer cadence, "isn't this a cozy scene to come home to?" Thomas Donovan stepped into the cabin, shaking water from his hat with a grin that suggested he had already formed opinions about finding his brother alone in a remote cabin with the woman who was supposedly just the ranch's housekeeper. "Forgive the intrusion," he added, his eyes taking in Eleanor's borrowed clothing and the intimate tableau by the fire. "But a man could drown out there, and I've been riding since dawn to reach home." Thomas Donovan's unexpected arrival brought with it a whirlwind of change to the quiet rhythm Eleanor had established at the ranch. Unlike his serious older brother, Thomas filled rooms with boisterous laughter and endless stories of his adventures, delivering horses to army outposts and mining camps across the territory. Where Matthew was measured and thoughtful, Thomas was impulsive and charming, his handsome face unmarked by tragedy, his movements unhindered by old injuries. "So, you're the famous Eleanor Mitchell," he declared the morning after his arrival, watching her prepare breakfast in the main house kitchen. "Matthew's letters mentioned you, but they didn't do you justice." Eleanor felt heat rise to her cheeks. "Your brother wrote to you about me?" "Brief mentions," Thomas clarified with a grin. "Dry facts about ranch matters. New housekeeper, improved bookkeeping. But Matthew's always been economical with words. I had to read between the lines." Before Eleanor could ask what exactly he had inferred from those lines, Matthew himself entered the kitchen, his expression growing guarded when he found his brother and Eleanor in conversation. "Thomas," he acknowledged, "I see you've introduced yourself." "Just getting acquainted with the woman who's transformed our humble abode," Thomas replied easily. "You failed to mention several key details in your letters, brother." Matthew's jaw tightened slightly. "Eleanor has been an invaluable addition to the ranch. Her skills with the accounts alone have saved us considerable expense." The formal praise felt like a step backward after the intimacy they had shared in the line shack before Thomas's interruption. Eleanor busied herself with the stove, trying not to show her disappointment at Matthew's sudden return to employer-employee boundaries. "I'm heading to town this morning," Matthew continued, addressing Eleanor directly for the first time. "Is there anything you need?" "Thread, perhaps," she replied, matching his neutral tone. "And if Beatrice Wilson has any letter paper, I'll see to it." He hesitated, then added more quietly, "And I'll speak with Sheriff Parker about those inquiries." "From Helena." Eleanor nodded, grateful that at least this matter remained a point of shared concern between them. "Thank you." After Matthew departed, Thomas helped himself to coffee, studying Eleanor with undisguised interest. "So, Miss Mitchell, tell me, how a woman clearly raised to finer things ends up keeping house on a Montana ranch?" The blunt question might have offended her from someone else, but Thomas's open curiosity held no malice. Still, Eleanor provided only the briefest outline of her journey: her arrival as a mail-order bride, the Caldwells' rejection, and Matthew's offer of employment. "Ah, the Caldwells," Thomas grimaced. "Edward's mother is a particular friend of a banker in Helena, formidable woman, not known for her compassion." "No," Eleanor agreed dryly. "Her compassion is not a quality I would attribute to her." Thomas laughed, the sound warm and genuine. "I like you, Eleanor Mitchell. My brother chose well." His expression grew more serious. "Though I worry now about these inquiries you mentioned. The Caldwells aren't people who forget slights easily." "It wasn't them I slighted," Eleanor pointed out. "Quite the opposite." "Perhaps," Thomas conceded. "But pride is a complicated thing, especially when paired with public knowledge of one's actions. The town knows they rejected you, and they know Matthew took you in. That alone might be enough to spur interest in your situation." His observation matched Eleanor's own concerns, though she had been hesitant to voice them even to Matthew. What if the Caldwells' inquiries weren't merely curiosity, but something more troubling? What if they somehow sought to justify their initial rejection by finding fault with her current position? The answer came sooner than expected. Matthew returned from town late that afternoon, his expression grave as he sought Eleanor out in the garden where she was gathering early spring herbs for Maria's kitchen. "Edward Caldwell was at the bank," he said without preamble. "He asked about you directly, making it clear he had business to discuss with you." Eleanor's hands stilled. On the rosemary she had been cutting. What sort of business? He wouldn't say. But Sheriff Parker heard from his deputy in Helena that the Caldwells have connections to a judge there, one who's been asking questions about ranch employment contracts and the legal status of mail-order arrangements. The implications were clear, and Eleanor felt a chill that had nothing to do with the spring breeze. "They're suggesting there's something improper about my presence here." Matthew nodded, his scarred jaw tight with anger. "It seems they've developed a sudden concern for your welfare and reputation, months after leaving you stranded in a snowstorm." "What could they possibly hope to gain?" Eleanor asked, though she feared she already knew. The Caldwells had been humiliated by town gossip about their treatment of her, and now they sought to reframe the narrative, perhaps even to suggest they had acted properly in rejecting a woman of questionable character. Control of the story, Matthew confirmed her thoughts, and possibly more. Edward was asking questions about the ranch's finances at the bank. This new information was more alarming. Eleanor knew better than most how precarious the ranch's situation had been when she arrived. The careful balancing of debts and income, the strategic decisions required to recover from the losses caused by the fire. Her accounting work had helped stabilize their position, but they were by no means secure against a determined financial adversary. "Do you think they mean to cause trouble for the ranch because of me?" The possibility sent a spike of fear through her heart. After everything Matthew had done for her, the thought that she might bring difficulty to his doorstep was unbearable. "I think," Matthew said carefully, "that Edward Caldwell is a weak man controlled by an ambitious mother, and that they both dislike being seen as anything less than righteous." It was a diplomatic assessment, but Eleanor understood the severity beneath his measured words. "Perhaps I should speak with them," she suggested reluctantly. "Clear the air and remove any pretense they have for concerning themselves with the ranch." Matthew's reaction was immediate and firm. "No, that's exactly what they want, to draw you into town, away from the ranch's protection, where they can control the encounter. But if they continue these inquiries, then we face them together," he interrupted, his voice softening as he took a step closer. "Eleanor, I didn't bring you to this ranch only to abandon you at the first sign of trouble." The echo of her initial abandonment by the Caldwells hung between them, making his promise of loyalty all the more significant. Eleanor felt something tight within her chest begin to loosen, a knot of old fear and expectation of rejection that had formed long before she ever set foot in Montana. "Thank you," she said simply, knowing he would understand all she couldn't put into words. The moment was interrupted by the approach of Thomas, who had spent the day reacquainting himself with the ranch after his months away. He took in their serious expressions with a raised eyebrow. "I take it town was eventful?" he inquired, directing the question to his brother. Matthew briefly explained the situation, his tone matter-of-fact, but his posture still protective as he stood near Eleanor in the garden. Thomas listened with growing concern, his usual casual demeanor replaced by thoughtful concentration. "The timing is suspicious," he noted when Matthew finished. "I've just returned from Helena myself, and there were rumors circulating about new banking regulations that might affect agricultural loans in the territory." Matthew frowned. "What sort of regulations?" "Nothing certain yet, but talk of stricter terms, higher interest rates for ranches with outstanding debts." Thomas glanced between his brother and Eleanor. "If the Caldwells are connected to the judge who's drafting these regulations, they could ensure the ranch faces financial pressure at the same time they're raising questions about Eleanor's presence here," Matthew concluded grimly. The three stood in silent contemplation of this possibility as the sun began to set behind the distant mountains, casting long shadows across the garden. Eleanor felt a surge of determination replace her earlier fear. She had not survived fire, and rejection had not built a new life from the ashes of her old one, only to become a liability to the people and place that had given her purpose again. "Then we must be prepared," she said firmly, "for whatever they intend." They didn't have to wait long. The very next morning, a formal letter arrived addressed to Eleanor, delivered by a messenger from town rather than through the regular post. The expensive stationery and official seal marked it as coming from the territorial court in Helena. Eleanor opened it with steady hands, Matthew and Thomas standing nearby in the main house study. Her eyes scanned the formal language, absorbing the meaning with growing indignation. "It's a summons," she said finally, looking up at the brothers. "I'm to appear before Judge Carlton in Helena 3 days from now to answer questions regarding my current living arrangement and employment situation. Apparently concerns have been raised about my welfare and the propriety of my position." Matthew's expression darkened. "Judge Carlton, longtime friend of the Caldwell family, if I recall correctly." Thomas nodded confirmation. Mrs. Caldwell's second cousin by marriage. This is no coincidence. The letter mentions potential implications for the ranch as well, Eleanor continued, her voice tight. Something about reviewing the fitness of certain establishments to maintain their current financial arrangements with territorial banks. The threat was thinly veiled but unmistakable. If Eleanor didn't appear, or if her answers didn't satisfy the judge, the ranch could face financial consequences engineered by the Caldwell's banking connections. "This is absurd," Thomas exclaimed. "They can't possibly claim legal authority over your employment choices." "They're not claiming authority over me specifically," Eleanor clarified, rereading a particular paragraph. "They're suggesting that the ranch may be operating inappropriately by housing a single woman without proper contracts or guardianship." She looked up, her expression troubled. "It's not about me, really. I'm just the means to pressure the ranch." Matthew had remained silent, his scarred face unreadable as he processed this development. Now he spoke, his voice holding a calm that belied the tension evident in his stance. "You're wrong, Eleanor. This is absolutely about you." His good eye met hers directly. "Or rather, about what you represent to the Caldwells, visible evidence of their poor judgment and callous behavior. And what you represent to Matthew," Thomas added quietly, earning a sharp look from his brother that he ignored. "The Caldwells aren't blind, Eleanor. They've seen what everyone in town has noticed, that my brother has found something worth emerging from his self-imposed isolation for, someone who sees beyond his scars." The frankness of this observation hung in the air between them. Eleanor felt heat rise to her cheeks, not from embarrassment but from the simple truth of it. She had seen beyond Matthew's scars because she had needed someone to see beyond hers. Not just the physical marks the fire had left, but the deeper wounds of abandonment and rejection that had shaped her life since. "Whatever their motivations," Matthew said after a moment, "we need to respond carefully. This summons isn't something we can ignore." "I'll go to Helena," Eleanor decided. "I'll answer their questions honestly and directly. I have nothing to hide and nothing to be ashamed of." "We'll go together," Matthew corrected firmly. "All of us. The ranch can spare us for a few days, and I won't have you facing this alone." Thomas nodded agreement. "I still have contacts in Helena who might provide useful information about what the Caldwells are really after, and 2 scarred Donovans make a more formidable impression than one," he added with a wink at Eleanor. The journey to Helena took 2 full days of hard riding, the spring roads still muddy from recent rains. They arrived dusty and tired at a modest hotel near the territorial courthouse, securing rooms for the night before Eleanor's scheduled appearance the following morning. While Thomas went to seek out his contacts, Matthew accompanied Eleanor on a brief walk through the bustling territorial capital. The city was larger than Willow Creek by orders of magnitude, with brick buildings lining the main streets and a constant flow of carriages and pedestrians that made Eleanor acutely aware of how accustomed she had grown to the ranch's peaceful isolation. "Are you nervous?" Matthew asked as they paused near a small park where early spring flowers had begun to bloom in carefully tended beds. Eleanor considered the question honestly. "Not about the questions they might ask. I know who I am and what I've done." She glanced at him, allowing her vulnerability to show. "I'm concerned about the ranch, though. About bringing trouble to your door after all you've done for me." Matthew shook his head, his expression gentle despite the scarred terrain of his features. "Eleanor, you haven't brought trouble. You've brought life back to a place that was merely existing before you arrived." He hesitated, then continued more softly, "To a man who was doing the same." The simple honesty of his words touched something deep within her. Before she could respond, Thomas appeared, slightly out of breath from hurrying to find them. "I've learned something important," he said without preamble. "The Caldwells aren't just raising questions about Eleanor's situation. They're offering an alternative. What do you mean? Matthew asked sharply. Edward Caldwell has apparently had a change of heart, Thomas explained. He's now willing to honor the original mail order arrangement, claiming his mother acted without his knowledge or consent in turning Eleanor away. Eleanor stared at him in disbelief. After all this time, that's absurd. It's calculated, Thomas corrected. My sources say the Caldwells are facing financial difficulties of their own. Edward's position at the bank isn't as secure as it once was, and his mother's excessive spending has depleted their resources. They need the appearance of respectability and stability more than ever. And marrying a scarred bride is suddenly preferable to financial ruin, Eleanor concluded bitterly. How flattering. Matthew's expression had grown thunderous. They abandoned her in a snowstorm, left her to die rather than honor their agreement, and now they think they can simply reclaim her like misplaced property. The raw anger in his voice silenced both Eleanor and Thomas momentarily. In all the months she had known him, Eleanor had never heard Matthew speak with such barely controlled fury. Even during the most difficult carving emergencies or when facing potential losses to the ranch, he had maintained his composure. I won't go to them, Eleanor said firmly, not for any reason or under any circumstance. Thomas's expression was sympathetic but concerned. The judge may not give you a choice, Eleanor. If he rules that the original contract is valid and that Edward acted under duress from his mother, then I'll leave the territory entirely, she declared, her chin lifting with determination. I won't be handed from one arrangement to another. Without my consent, not again. Matthew had fallen silent, his scarred face unreadable as he processed this new information. When he finally spoke, his voice was controlled once more, but with an underlying intensity that held both Eleanor and Thomas's complete attention. There is another option, he said quietly. One that would render the original contract null and void, regardless of the judge's inclinations. Eleanor looked at him questioningly. Marry me instead, Matthew said simply. Today, before the hearing. The directness of the proposal left Eleanor momentarily speechless. Thomas, displaying unusual tact, murmured something about checking on their horses and quickly made himself scarce, leaving them alone in the small park. Matthew, Eleanor finally managed, her heart racing, you don't need to do this. I won't let the Caldwells pressure you into... This has nothing to do with the Caldwells, he interrupted gently, and everything to do with what I've wanted. To say, since that night in the line shack. He took a step closer, close enough that she could see the flecks of gold in his good eye. I love you, Eleanor, not out of gratitude or convenience or shared circumstance, but for who you are, your strength, your intelligence, your compassion. The simple declaration, spoken without flourish or pretense, was all the more powerful. For its plainness, it matched the man himself, direct, honest, unadorned with false sentiment. If you don't feel the same, he continued, or if you need more time, I understand. We'll find another way to deal with the Caldwells, but if you do... He hesitated, and for the first time since she had known him, Matthew Donovan looked uncertain. If you could see a future with a scarred rancher who has nothing to offer but his heart and his land, then I'm asking you to choose that future. Today, Eleanor felt tears gather in her eyes, not from sorrow, but from a joy so intense it bordered on pain. How long had she guarded her heart, convinced that her scars made her unworthy of genuine love? How many times had she settled for less than she desired because she believed it was all she deserved? Yes, she said, her voice steady despite the tears now trailing down her cheeks. Yes, Matthew. I'll marry you today. His scarred face transformed with a smile, unlike any she had seen before, open, unguarded, radiant with happiness. He reached for her hand, his damaged fingers entwining with hers in a grip that promised security without imprisonment, strength without domination. Then let's find a minister, he said, and make the Caldwells' plans irrelevant. They were married an hour later in a small church near the park, Thomas serving as witness, along with the minister's wife. Eleanor wore her plain blue dress, her hair arranged simply, her scarred face uncovered and unashamed, as she spoke her vows to the equally scarred man who had seen her true beauty when others had turned away. The next morning when they appeared before Judge Carlton, it was as Mr. and Mrs. Donovan, rendering the Caldwells' claims immediately moot. Edward's face had paled at the sight of them entering the courtroom together, his mother's expression hardening into barely concealed fury. The judge, confronted with a legal marriage that superseded any prior arrangement, had no choice but to dismiss the case. Eleanor stood tall beside her husband, her hand firmly in his, as they walked from the courthouse into the clear spring sunshine of a new beginning. Not as a rejected bride or a pitied employee, but as a woman who had found her true worth in the eyes of a man who understood that beauty often burned brightest after surviving the flames. Up next, you've got two more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hit the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out.